Hi, I'm Reid Martens, and in this video I'll be reviewing the historical accuracy of the 2014 film Selma. The film follows Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, and the rest of their allies as they conduct protests to fight for African American rights to vote. In the movie, Martin Luther King faces opposition from local and federal officials, and even some from within his own coalition of protesters. It chronicles his protests in Selma, Alabama, leading to his famous march from Selma to the capital of Alabama, Montgomery. The movie picks up from where Martin Luther King Jr. won his Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 after getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Shortly after that, King meets with President Lyndon B. Johnson in the movie, where they discuss the next policy issue that they should focus on. Johnson wants to focus on his war on poverty, while King wants another Civil Rights Act passed to protect African Americans' right to vote. This conversation was depicted well, as in real life, the two discussed the problems facing the black community, but disagreed on the next step and what the most realistic step would be. Johnson believed that that the war on poverty would be the best next step in bettering American society, but also doubted his ability to pass a Civil Rights Act or a voter rights bill at that time. King recalled Johnson saying, "Martin, you're absolutely right about that. I'm going to do it eventually, but I can't get a voting rights bill passed in this session of Congress." The relationship between King and President Johnson, although depicted well in the beginning, becomes more and more inaccurate as the film progresses. The film depicts Johnson opposing King until near the end of the film, when he finally gives his support to King and passes the voter rights bill. In reality, Johnson was quick to begin drafting his legislation and working with King and the SCLC as he began on Wednesday, January 27th, 1965, which was just a couple weeks into the protests. Then, on the next day, Johnson came out in support of the SCLC and their protests in Selma. When King announced that he would be meeting with the president before he actually made an appointment with the Johnson administration on Friday, January 29th, the president's office made the meeting happen instead of just simply turning him away and embarrassing King. So that meeting was later described by King as very successful. The president made it very clear to me that he was determined during his administration to see all the rights and obstacles removed to the right of Negroes to vote. The film has the relationship between King and President Johnson closer to reality when Johnson meets with Governor of Alabama, George Wallace, where in real life the president advised Wallace to do three things: declare his support for the right of universal suffrage, assure the right to peacefully assemble in Alabama, and hold a biracial meeting with the state's citizens. Though the film depicts the correct starting and ending point in King and Johnson's relationship, they misrepresent it throughout the majority of the film. This change was probably made to create a greater underdog story, because who doesn't like an underdog story? Another part of the movie that takes liberties with the events in Selma is the relationship between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC. In the film, the SNCC is depicted as opposing the SCLC's move into Selma, as they feared that the SCLC would fail and then move to a new city, leaving the SNCC to pick up the pieces. In reality, the SNCC felt as though their work had run its course in Selma and welcomed the SCLC, as they wanted a rejuvenation of the community. The film shows the SNCC becoming more and more on board with the SCLC, despite a few outbursts, and shows part of the protesters' success as the unity of the coalition. In reality, the shift was actually quite the opposite. Like I said before, the SNCC wanted the SCLC's presence, but as they stayed, tensions rose. Not just between the SCLC and the SNCC, but between the SCLC and the rest of their allies. Part of this stemmed from the SCLC's unwillingness to accept success through a special court order or community agreement, as it wouldn't apply to other counties in the country, while local organizers saw this as a reasonable goal. Another source of tension was that the SCLC had a habit of dictating responses and actions without consulting any of their allies and just expecting them to comply. An example of this comes on Monday, February 1st, 1965, when a judge ordered an appearance book be created for African Americans to register to vote that would be served on a first-come, first-served basis. So this was supposed to reduce the wait times for voter registration, and the Voter League president at the time, Frederick Reese, accepted this judgment. The problem arose later that day when the SCLC's Jim Bevel denounced the judgment, stating that "we've changed our mind" to the press, without consulting any of their allies. So this tension continued to grow among the SNCC and the SCLC, so that when the SCLC began to plan the march from Selma to Montgomery, the SNCC was unsure if they even wanted to endorse it, as they saw it as an unnecessary waste of resources. The Selma project director, Silas Norman, detailed the disagreement as, "The SCLC pushes the idea that local people need leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., while the SCC says that local people need to build their own leaders out of their own communities." The SNCC did end up endorsing the march, but shortly after, tensions reached a breaking point, and the SNCC decided to move their base of operations from Selma to Montgomery. This was to get away from the SCLC. Ultimately, both organizations' work did end up benefiting one another, as while the SCLC fought a legal battle to get a court order allowing the march, the SNCC brought media attention by holding protests in the state capital, Montgomery. The decision to depict a more unified activist group was probably done to create a more clear antagonist and protagonist of the film. So Selma does take some liberties with the events that occur, but that's to be expected, as it is a movie and not a documentary, and they really shouldn't be held to the same standard of accuracy. The film does not change the basic truths of the event, which is that Martin Luther King Jr. and his allies peacefully protest for African Americans' rights to vote and experienced hardships in that pursuit. Because of this, Selma does operate as a good piece of popular history.